Everyone sees Jonathan Roumie today as the man who brought Jesus to life on screen. Calm, powerful, faith-filled, inspiring millions across the world through The Chosen. But what almost nobody knows is this. There was a time when Jonathan Roumie was one step away from walking away from acting forever. No fame, no recognition, no certainty that God had any plan left for him. Behind the scenes, his life was quietly falling apart. Auditions led to rejection after rejection. The phone stopped ringing. Bills stacked higher than his hope. And the dream he had chased for years began to feel more like a burden than a calling. Late at night, alone with his thoughts, Jonathan asked the question so many people are afraid to admit. What if I misunderstood God? What if the sacrifice wasn't leading anywhere? What if faith wasn't enough? And just when doubt was winning, just when quitting felt easier than believing, an unexpected name entered his story. Mark Wahlberg. Yis, that Mark Wahlberg, the Hollywood star, known for action movies, discipline, and success. Not someone people expected to be quietly changing lives behind the scenes. There were no cameras, no interviews, no social media posts. In fact, what Mark did was kept secret for years. Because it wasn't about publicity. It was about purpose. At a moment when Jonathan felt invisible to the world, one conversation with Mark would plant a seed that refused to die. A seed of patience. A seed of faith. A seed of endurance. And the reason this story matters isn't because of celebrity. It matters because what Mark said, and what he chose to do, would later impact millions of lives across the globe, even though no one saw it coming at the time. This wasn't a miracle that happened overnight. It wasn't a dramatic Hollywood rescue. It was something quieter. Stronger, more dangerous to doubt, because sometimes, the smallest moments, the ones no one notices, are the ones that decide whether a person gives up or becomes who they were always meant to be. And what happened next would change Jonathan Roumie's life forever. Long before Jonathan Roumie ever stepped onto a set as Jesus. Long before millions would recognize his face. He was living a life almost no one saw. A quiet life, a heavy life. Jonathan had moved to Los Angeles chasing a dream fueled by faith and passion. Acting wasn't just a career choice for him. It was something he believed God had placed in his heart. Every role, every audition, every small opportunity felt like a step toward purpose. But purpose, as he soon learned, doesn't always come with clarity. Days turned into months, months turned into years. Auditions came and went, with polite smiles and empty promises. We'll be in touch. You were great, but not this time. Sometimes there was silence instead, the kind that echoes louder than rejection. Jonathan worked odd jobs to survive, voiceover gigs, small roles, anything that paid enough to keep the lights on. But even with the grind, money was always tight. Bills arrived faster than paychecks. Savings slowly disappeared. And the hardest part wasn't the struggle, it was the waiting. He prayed daily, sometimes confidently, sometimes desperately, sometimes angrily. God, I said yes. I showed up. I trusted you, so why am I still here? Faith didn't vanish, but it was tested in ways no sermon ever prepares you for. Late at night, doubt crept in quietly. Not screaming, just whispering. Maybe you're not good enough. Maybe this was never meant to happen. Jonathan didn't talk about this much. From the outside, he looked like someone holding on inside. He was tired, emotionally, spiritually, physically. And yet, in the middle of this uncertainty, another story was unfolding. Mark Wahlberg's. By that time, Mark was already a household name. Movies, money, fame. The world saw success. But what most people didn't see was the internal shift Mark was going through. After years in Hollywood, he had begun reassessing everything. His habits, his values, his faith. He started waking up early to pray, structuring his days with discipline, choosing silence over noise, purpose over popularity. Faith wasn't something he talked about loudly. It was something he practiced privately. Mark knew firsthand that success without meaning feels empty. He had climbed the mountain only to realize that the view doesn't matter if you forget why you started climbing. Somewhere in this season of transformation, their paths crossed. No dramatic introduction, no spotlight moment, just two men at very different stages of life, connected by faith, struggle, and timing. Jonathan didn't see Mark as a celebrity in that moment. He saw someone grounded, focused, at peace. And Mark saw something in Jonathan that others didn't. Not fame, not potential box, office numbers, but sincerity. A man wrestling with calling. A man trying to stay faithful when nothing was working. A man standing at the edge of quitting, without admitting it out loud. Their conversations were honest, raw, unpolished. Jonathan spoke about exhaustion, about feeling forgotten, about wondering whether obedience was worth the cost. Mark listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't minimize the struggle, didn't offer quick answers, because he knew something important. When someone is on the brink of giving up what they need, most isn't advice, it's understanding. Jonathan expected encouragement. What he didn't expect was how seriously Mark took him. This wasn't a passing conversation. This wasn't Hollywood politeness. Mark recognized a familiar battle, the kind that happens when faith meets delay. And while Jonathan didn't know it yet, this moment, this season, was quietly preparing him for something far greater than he imagined. Because sometimes before God elevates someone publicly, He surrounds them privately, with the right voices, at the right moment, for the right reason. And the next step Mark would take wouldn't involve fame, money, or headlines. It would involve something far more powerful. Belief, when belief was almost gone. There comes a moment in every long struggle when strength runs out. For Jonathan Roumie, that moment didn't arrive loudly. It came quietly, disguised as exhaustion. Years of waiting had worn him down. Not just physically, but spiritually. He was still praying, still showing up, still saying the right words, but something inside him was cracking. He began questioning things he had once been certain about. Was this really God's plan? Or just his own dream? Was patience faith, or was it denial? How long was he supposed to hold on before letting go became wisdom? Jonathan didn't say these things publicly. He didn't complain on social media. He didn't blame anyone. But inside, the conflict was relentless. Every audition felt heavier than the last. Every rejection felt more personal. Every not yet felt closer to a never. Then came the day that nearly broke him. Another audition, another long wait. Another hopeful drive home, followed by silence. No callback, no explanation, just the familiar emptiness. That night, Jonathan sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by overdue bills and unanswered prayers. The room was quiet, but his thoughts were loud. I can't do this anymore. Not in anger. Not in drama, just honesty. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider walking away. Not because he didn't believe in God, but because believing was starting to hurt too much. And that was when he finally said it out loud. In a conversation with Mark Wahlberg, Jonathan admitted what he had been hiding. I think I'm done. I don't know how much longer I can wait. The words surprised, even him. Mark didn't react the way most people would. He didn't panic. He didn't rush to motivate. He didn't quote scripture. He paused. Because he understood something crucial. This wasn't a crisis of talent. It was a crisis of endurance. Jonathan continued, his voice steady, but heavy. I feel like I did everything right. I showed up. I trusted God. I sacrificed, and nothing is happening. There it was. The unspoken fear behind every long season of waiting. What if obedience doesn't work? That question is dangerous. Not because it lacks faith, but because it reveals pain. Mark had faced versions of this battle himself. Different circumstances, same weight. He knew success didn't erase doubt. It only hides it better. He leaned forward and finally spoke. You're not wrong for feeling this way. Those words landed hard. Because validation is rare when people expect you to be strong. Then Mark said something Jonathan would carry with him for years. God's delays are not God's denials, but they are God's tests. Jonathan listened in silence. Mark continued. When things don't move, it's not always because nothing is happening. Sometimes it's because everything is. He explained how growth often happens in hidden places, where pride dies, patience forms, and purpose deepens. Places no one applauds. Places that feel pointless while you're inside them. Jonathan wanted to believe him, but belief felt fragile. What if I miss my moment? Jonathan asked. What if waiting costs me everything? Mark answered without hesitation. If you quit now, you'll never know what was waiting on the other side of your endurance. That sentence changed the room. Because the real conflict wasn't about acting, it was about identity. If Jonathan walked away, who would he be? If he stayed, how much more could he lose? Mark didn't promise success. He didn't guarantee fame. He didn't say things would get easier. Instead, he gave Jonathan a choice. You can leave, and you'll be fine. Or you can stay, and trust that obedience still matters, even when results don't show. That was the hardest option. Staying without proof, believing without evidence, enduring without applause. Jonathan left that conversation unsettled, but not empty. The doubt was still there. The fear hadn't disappeared. But something new had entered the struggle. Hope. Not the loud kind. The quiet kind that whispers. Just one more step. Jonathan didn't know yet that this moment, this internal battle, was the final test before everything changed. Because the greatest turning points in life rarely look like breakthroughs. They look like decisions made in silence. And the decision Jonathan would make next, to stay just a little longer, would set the stage for a role that would change his life and touch millions around the world. After that conversation, nothing changed on the surface. There was no sudden phone call, no miracle audition, no overnight breakthrough. Jonathan Roumie woke up the next morning to the same reality. The same small apartment, the same uncertainty, the same unanswered prayers. But something inside him had shifted for the first time in a long while. He wasn't waiting for rescue. He was choosing endurance. Mark Wahlberg didn't disappear after that conversation. He also didn't make grand promises. What he did instead was far more powerful and far more rare. He stayed present. Mark checked in, not constantly, not intrusively, just enough to remind Jonathan that he wasn't invisible. How are you holding up? Still showing up. Don't rush what's being built. Simple words, quiet consistency. And then Mark began doing something that would quietly reshape Jonathan's path. Not through fame, but through structure. He talked to Jonathan about discipline, not the loud, punishing kind, but the kind rooted in respect for purpose. Talent isn't what keeps you ready, Mark told him. Discipline does. Mark shared how he structured his own days. Early mornings, prayer before work, physical training, reading. Silence, not because it looked impressive, but because it kept him grounded when life got loud. Jonathan listened carefully. He began adopting those habits himself. He woke up earlier. He prayed even when he didn't feel inspired. He treated preparation like obedience, not desperation. Slowly, something began to change, not in his circumstances, but in his posture. He stopped chasing approval, stopped attaching his worth to auditions, stopped seeing rejection as punishment. Mark also helped in ways no one saw. He encouraged Jonathan to refine his craft, not to impress Hollywood, but to honor the gift he believed God had given him. He made introductions, not favors, but connections rooted in integrity. He pointed Jonathan toward people who valued purpose over hype. No shortcuts, no handouts, just alignment. And most importantly, Mark reminded Jonathan of something crucial. Your role isn't to force the outcome. Your role is to stay faithful to the process. That sentence became an anchor. There were still hard days. Days Jonathan questioned everything again. Days discipline felt pointless. But now, when doubt rose, he had a framework to return to. Faith structure, consistency. Mark never once said, "You're going to be famous." He never hinted at future success, because the turning point wasn't about prediction. It was about preparation. Months passed. Jonathan continued working, continued auditioning, continued waiting. And then, quietly, something small happened. A script crossed his path. Not big, not flashy, not backed by major studios. A project rooted in faith. A story told with sincerity instead of spectacle. The role wasn't guaranteed. The budget wasn't impressive. The future wasn't certain, but something in Jonathan's spirit recognized it immediately. This wasn't about career advancement. This was about calling. When Jonathan approached the role, he didn't do it with desperation. He did it with readiness. The discipline Mark had encouraged showed up in his preparation. The patience Mark had modeled showed up in his performance. The humility Mark had lived out showed up in his presence. Jonathan didn't know how important this role would become. He only knew he was finally showing up as his whole self, not chasing success, but offering obedience. Mark watched from a distance. No public praise, no announcements. Just quiet satisfaction. Because the goal was never to create a star. It was to help a man stay faithful long enough to step into what he was meant to carry. And as Jonathan stepped into that role, something deeper clicked. All the waiting, all the silence, all the struggle, it hadn't been wasted. It had been shaping him for something that required depth, not just talent. And the moment that would change everything was already in motion. Jonathan just didn't see it yet. Because the greatest turning points rarely announce themselves. They arrive softly, disguised as obedience. What happened next didn't look like success at first. There were no headlines, no trending clips, no industry buzz. Just a small production. With a big heart, the project Jonathan had stepped into didn't come from a major studio. It wasn't backed by Hollywood power players or massive budgets. In fact, many people didn't think it would go anywhere at all. It was called The Chosen, a faith-based series crowdfunded. Independent, risky, to most of the industry. It was invisible, but to Jonathan, it felt different. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to prove himself. He wasn't chasing validation. He wasn't forcing doors open. He was simply present. When Jonathan auditioned and later stepped into the role of Jesus, he didn't approach it like an actor searching for applause. He approached it like a servant carrying responsibility. All the waiting had done something unexpected. It had stripped him. No ego, no urgency, no fear of being overlooked. Just reverence. Every line he spoke carried weight. Every pause carried meaning. Every moment felt personal. Those long years of silence had taught him how to listen. And now, that quiet depth came through on screen. When the first episodes were released, something unusual happened. People didn't just watch. They felt seen. Messages started pouring in. Viewers wrote about healing, about restored faith, about hope returning after years of doubt. Pastors noticed. Families noticed. People who hadn't stepped inside a church in decades noticed. And slowly, the numbers began to grow. Millions of views. Then tens of millions, then audiences across the world. The Chosen became one of the most watched faith-based series in history. Jonathan Roumie, once invisible, once exhausted, once ready to quit, became the face of a portrayal that touched hearts across cultures, languages, and generations. And that's when people began asking questions. Where did he come from? How did this happen? Why does this feel so different? Behind the scenes, the answer wasn't flashy. It was faith, forged in waiting. Only then did the quiet truth begin to surface, years before the success. Before the applause, before the world knew Jonathan's name. Mark Wahlberg had stood beside him, not on stage, not on camera, but in the shadows, when belief was fragile and quitting felt reasonable. Mark never claimed credit. He never told the story. In fact, most people didn't learn about his involvement until much later, and even then, only in fragments. Because Mark had never helped Jonathan for recognition. He helped him because he recognized something sacred. A man being shaped for a role that required depth, not hype. When someone once asked Mark about Jonathan's rise, he brushed it off quietly. He did the work, Mark said. I just reminded him not to stop. That was it. He did the work, no self-praise. Jonathan, however, never forgot. In interviews, he spoke openly about the season before The Chosen, the doubt, the exhaustion, the temptation to walk away. And when he mentioned Mark, it was never with drama. It was with gratitude, because Jonathan understood something most people miss. The people who change your life the most aren't always the ones who give you opportunity. They're the ones who help you survive the waiting. Looking back, everything made sense. The rejection, the silence, the long delays. If success had come earlier, Jonathan wouldn't have been ready. If fame had arrived sooner, the weight of the role might have crushed him. But because he waited, because he endured, he stepped into the chosen not just as an actor, but as a man prepared to carry meaning. And Mark watched it all unfold quietly. Because the true reveal wasn't that Jonathan became famous. The reveal was this: a single conversation, a season of discipline, a refusal to quit. Those unseen moments didn't just change one man's career. They helped create a story that would reach millions around the world. And the final chapters of that story weren't about fame at all. They were about legacy. Success changes many things, but it doesn't change what was planted in silence. As The Chosen continued to grow, Jonathan Roumie's life transformed in ways he had never imagined. Interviews multiplied. Invitations arrived from around the world. His face became recognizable. His voice carried weight, but something about him remained unchanged. Those who met Jonathan off camera often noticed it immediately. There was no arrogance, no sense of entitlement, no urgency to impress. Instead, there was gratitude. Jonathan often spoke about the journey, not the destination, about the years before The Chosen, when doors stayed closed and prayers felt unanswered. He didn't hide that part of his story, because he knew something important: if people only see the victory, they'll never understand the cost. In quiet moments, Jonathan reflected on how close he had come to walking away, how easily the story could have ended differently, not in failure, but in resignation. And every time those thoughts surfaced, one truth followed: he hadn't survived that season alone. Mark Wahlberg's presence during those years wasn't loud or dramatic, but it had been steady, and that steadiness mattered. Jonathan never described Mark as a savior. He described him as a reminder that faith doesn't always feel strong, a reminder that discipline protects calling, a reminder that purpose often grows in places where no one is clapping. As The Chosen reached new audiences, Jonathan began receiving messages from people whose lives had been deeply impacted. Parents who found hope again, prisoners who felt seen, people who had walked away from faith and were slowly finding their way back. Reading those messages often overwhelmed him, because he knew how easily it all could have never happened. One different decision, one moment of quitting, one night where exhaustion won, and none of those stories would exist. That realization kept him grounded. Jonathan became intentional about how he spoke, how he showed up, and how he carried responsibility. Playing Jesus wasn't just a role, it was a trust. And trust requires humility. He didn't see himself as the center of the story. He saw himself as part of something bigger, something that had been built long before he ever stepped into the role. When asked about fame, Jonathan often redirected the conversation. "This isn't about me," he would say. "It's about what people are experiencing." That perspective didn't come from success. Meanwhile, Mark Wahlberg continued his own journey quietly. He never attached himself to Jonathan's rise. He didn't retell the story for credit. He didn't insert himself into the narrative, because that was never the point. Mark understood that real impact doesn't announce itself. It simply remains. Occasionally, when the subject came up, Mark spoke simply. "Sometimes people just need someone to tell them not to quit." That sentence carried weight because it came from experience, not theory. Mark knew what it meant to rebuild a life, to choose discipline over chaos, and to place faith above applause. And he knew that the strongest support is often invisible. Jonathan, in turn, carried that lesson forward. As younger actors and creatives approached him with questions, doubt, and fear, he didn't give them guarantees. He gave them honesty. He told them about waiting, about uncertainty, about staying faithful when results refused to show up. He became the kind of person he once needed: someone who listens, someone who doesn't rush answers, someone who understands that endurance is often the real miracle. That was the true resolution of the story: not fame, not recognition, not success, but continuity. A lesson passed quietly from one life to another, and then carried forward again. Jonathan didn't just step into a role that changed his career. He stepped into a responsibility shaped by years of unseen preparation. And Mark didn't just help a struggling actor. He helped preserve a calling long enough for it to reach the world. Looking back, it was never about the moment when everything finally worked. It was about all the moments when nothing did, and someone still chose to stay. Because life rarely turns on grand gestures, it turns on small decisions made consistently. A conversation that happens at the right time. A voice that speaks when doubt is loudest. A refusal to let someone quit when they're too tired to see clearly. That's how lives change. Not all at once, not publicly, but permanently. And as Jonathan continues his journey, he carries that truth with him. A reminder etched into every step forward. What grows in silence often carries the greatest weight when it finally speaks. Every story has a moment where it stops being about success and starts being about meaning. This is that moment, because when you look at Jonathan Roumie's journey, the lesson isn't that he became famous, it's that he didn't quit when quitting made sense. And when you look at Mark Wahlberg's role in the story, the lesson isn't that a celebrity helped someone rise. It's that real influence doesn't need an audience. We live in a world obsessed with outcomes. We celebrate arrivals, not endurance. We praise results, not patience. We applaud the finish line, but forget the miles walked in silence. Yet the most important parts of life are almost always hidden. No one sees the late nights filled with doubt. No one hears the prayers whispered through exhaustion. No one applauds the discipline that keeps someone going when motivation disappears. But those moments matter. They matter because they shape who you become before the world ever notices. Jonathan's story reminds us that calling doesn't come with a schedule. Purpose doesn't operate on our timeline, and faith isn't proven by how loudly we believe, but by how long we endure when nothing seems to be happening. If success had arrived sooner, the depth wouldn't have been there. If recognition had come earlier, humility might not have survived. The waiting wasn't punishment. It was preparation. And Mark's role in the story reminds us of something equally important. You don't need to be the main character to change someone's life. Sometimes the greatest impact comes from staying quiet, staying present, and staying consistent when someone else is on the verge of giving up. A single conversation. A reminder to keep going. A voice that says, "Don't quit yet." That's how destinies are protected. Not through control, not through pressure, but through belief. Offered at the exact moment, it's almost gone. So if you're watching this and you feel stuck, if you've been waiting longer than you expected, if you've been faithful without seeing fruit, if you've been wondering whether obedience is worth the cost, this story is for you. Because maybe nothing is wrong, maybe nothing is late, maybe you're not being ignored, you're being shaped. The silence you're in right now might be doing work you can't yet. See, the delay might be building strength you'll need later. And the doubt you're fighting might be the final test before clarity arrives. Don't confuse quiet seasons with empty ones. Seeds grow underground. And if you're someone who sees others struggling, if you notice people quietly carrying weight, if you sense someone is close to giving up, be the person who stays. You don't have to fix them. You don't need perfect words. You don't need recognition. Just presence, just honesty, just consistency. You never know how close someone is to walking away from the very thing they were meant to carry. Mark Wahlberg never set out to change the world through this one act. He simply chose not to look away. And Jonathan Roumie didn't become who he is because of talent alone. He became who he is because he stayed when it would have been easier to leave. That's the real lesson. Not fame. Not success. Not applause. Endurance. Humility. Faith that holds on even when the future refuses to explain itself. So wherever you are today, waiting, doubting, hoping, or helping, remember this: what you do in silence still counts. Who you are when no one is watching still matters. And the season you're in right now might be preparing you for impact far beyond what you can imagine. If this story spoke to you, type faith in the comments. If you believe patience still has power, type stay. And tell me, where are you watching from? I want to thank every person who chose not to give up today. Because sometimes, the greatest stories don't begin with success. They begin with the decision to keep going. One more day,